All right. So, in the textbook, fashion and clothes are listed as channels of nonverbal communication. However, as fashion is developing in the United States, clothes and fashion are becoming increasingly more complex in what they are communicating. How is this changing? What are clothes and outfits are quote saying, and what are new messages being communicated? Should I
Yeah,
That's a
can you
good
repeat it one more
question.
time?
Okay. In the textbook, fashion and clothes are listed as channels of nonverbal communication. However, as fashion is developing in the United States, clothes and fashion are becoming increasingly more complex in what they are communicating. How is this changing? What our clothes and outfits are saying, and what new messages are being communicated? Sure. Yeah. You
For
can
me,
just talk. You don't have to raise your hand.
I don't know. Okay, all right. So I think like with fashion, for example, in the United States, it's becoming a trend that the more expensive clothes you kind of wear, the more like cool it is in some sense. So I feel like a lot of people in our society think through like expensive clothes or designer clothes also they communicate wealth to the outside, and also like their status, like their status is being impacted positively by that. But yeah, I think that's just one side of our society that has that like outlook on that issue.
Yeah, I read an article on basically how fashion in the United States, people are moving more away from, like diamonds and expensive looking items and starting to repurpose things such as, I don't know if anyone knows, but the big blue IKEA bags, they're like repurposing those into incorporating them into fashion. And so even though that the IKEA bag is, $2-3 or whatever it may be, it's still a status symbol, even though it's not necessarily automatically associated with wealth or like socioeconomic status, which is interesting, I thought.
No, I think fashion is getting kind of not weird, but like people are getting innovative, and I think it does have a lot to do with kind of what he was saying, like status and like what you wear, but like it's not so much what it looks like, but it's like where it's from. Like for example, Off-White, how this guy makes a lot of money for labeling things, like his shoe says shoe, and like you can buy it for $1,000. So
it's a lot of about the brand image also. So a lot of people are paying, like if there's a t-shirt, a white t-shirt, and it has nothing on it, it might be like $10, and if it says Supreme with the Supreme logo, it might be like $100. So
yeah, exactly.
that's pretty crazy.
Another interesting thing about all of those trends is the fast fashion, and that all of those things are really expensive and super fashionable right now, but in a year or two, they're going to be worth nothing. And so I think those trends are kind of interesting because not only are they paying a lot and showing their like, social status through what they're wearing, but they also have to be aware that those things aren't going to be very valuable pretty soon. And it's going to be just as expensive as like a plain white t-shirt, like you said. And also, Nolan, you mentioned earlier that like even those IKEA bags that aren't very expensive are becoming a statement. I think it's interesting to see that like now the grunge look that looks super inexpensive is actually very expensive, and like the holes in the jeans and the ripped sweaters and all of that have become really stylish, even though they don't look like immediately. You don't think that trend is something that would be really expensive, but it is.
And I think those brands like the IKEA bag and Supreme and Off-White, they're deemed as like hype now. And with social media, it's like the whole hype beast community. I guess it also creates like an identity for people who collect like sneakers or like those clothes and those really expensive branded clothes. It just creates another type of community for people as well.
Mm-hmm. I think another interesting thing is that I totally forgot what I was going to say. Somebody else go.
Yeah, living outside of LA, it's interesting to see because everyone has, their own unique fashion, and it's interesting to see how fashion has evolved because normally I feel like cultures and societies have kind of left it narrow. You have some options for whatever, but not as many. But in LA, and as I think gender, I don't know, like gender acceptance and gender fluidity and everything going along with gender and their identity, and how more people like Bad Bunny or what would be considered cross-dressing a couple of years ago, or back in the day. But it's interesting to see how that has also transformed fashion, because now guys are starting to like slowly become what would be considered more feminine, I think, in American culture, but not necessarily a bad way. It's just interesting leaving more options for their fashion and outfits to communicate different things about themselves, which is interesting.
Going along with that, I think it's coming from the South, I think it's interesting to move to LA, where everything is, you can get away with wearing whatever you want, no matter how unique it is. People really respect it and appreciate it and like see your style and your creativity in it. Whereas in the South, it's very much so everybody's kind of expected, or at least especially boys are all expected to kind of wear the exact same thing, khakis, t-shirt, all Vineyard Vines. And so it's kind of interesting to be able to see that portrays kind of I don't want to say like super collectivist, but just more similar. Everybody's doing more similar things. Nobody's being super individualistic, but in LA, it's really like prized to be wearing sort of unique things. And it's like really looked up upon. So yeah.
I agree with that. I think like the line of acceptance in LA, for example, is like much broader than, for example, in I also spent like some time before coming to LA in Oklahoma, and then if you're like wearing a certain or like feminine clothes, for example, most of the people directly associated that with like some stereotypes that they are used to. So if a guy would wear like tight jeans or something, most of the people would associate that with that person, for example, like being heterosexual or something. So I don't know, I feel like in LA there's like a much bigger acceptance for uniqueness, as you already said.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like coming from an Asian culture, the way that we dress is usually pretty conservative, but coming to LA and like, especially going to like Coachella, where you see guys who are shirtless, or like just the way that people dress is more revealing. It was definitely like a little bit of a culture shock to me, but I think it's cool that people are able to express themselves in those ways, and just it's just a nice way for people to express themselves.
Definitely, I agree.
So the next.
I go next.
That was a great question, Nolan. I think Abby is next.
Abby.
Okay, I will read my question to you guys. So it says, the book explains that often nonverbal communication creates problems due to ambiguity. What might the role of new age technology play in the ambiguity of communication? Further, what drawbacks or benefits does texting have in relation to the ambiguity of communication? And what unintended positive or negative consequences do things like emojis or GIFs add to the situation?
Yeah, I think texting has like a lot of ambiguity, because like when you text, you don't really know like the tone that they're using. You kind of just have to imagine like what they're saying or how they're saying it. And so like the same sentence with a bunch of tones can mean very different things. And I think a lot of times like I don't know how to respond, so I just like laugh. I'm like, like whatever you're saying. But like no, I think it's definitely difficult to like communicate through text or get your like what you intend, or get your intentions across, kind of thing.
I agree with that, what Maddie said, because I think like a huge reason why often there are like miscommunications or like miscommunications via texting or because of texting is because the other person cannot see the non-verbal communication that's being like transmitted. So like, I don't know, I could say something and mean it in a totally different way than it's coming across on the text message. So I think that's like a huge factor why.
I totally agree. And it's weird when you can't see someone's body language or facial expressions, or whether they're saying it with sarcasm as a joke or whether they're being really serious about it. I think all those like nonverbal things are so important that we might not even realize while we're talking face to face, but it's so much harder to read off somebody when you're texting.
It's also interesting to note like the divide, because our generation, Gen Z and millennials, tend to like understand because we have like a whole texting language. We grew up with it. And so I think it leads to a little bit less miscommunication between like if we're only Gen Zers or Gen Z and millennials are talking. But then as soon as I talk to my parents or anything like that, I always have to remember that the language that I'm using in my text messages isn't necessarily something that they're going to pick up right away, because now I read all of our, shortened LOL or RN or whatever it may be. I just read it naturally and it makes sense. But then for my parents, I feel like it's more laborious and them really having to concentrate on what we're trying to say.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that sometimes our intention and meaning gets lost behind text messages, because when we say okay, like the tone that we use, if we were to verbally communicate it and in person, it's there. But through text, okay can mean just one word can mean a lot of things. And same with text language, like words like LOL. Sometimes people will say sarcastically, and we just use it so nonchalantly sometimes, even though it means laugh out loud. Sometimes we won't even be actually laughing out loud,
And I think go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I think also with this, going along with that, also like cultural identity plays a role there, because I remember transitioning from Germany to the United States, and like one small cultural change was that, for example, in Germany, when we text, we use way more like emojis. And as you guys already said, like in the US, there's much more like LOL and LMAO and all that stuff. So at the beginning, I was using like a lot of emojis when I was texting with people, and they were like, dude, like, stop sending all those emojis. Like, what are you doing? It's weird. So I guess also identity can play a role there. Like even in a different country, a certain emoji or anything can have a different meaning than, can be like normal in one country and being like weird in another country. So I don't know.
Kind of going off of what you were saying with emojis. I think emojis have helped in a way, because like if you're laughing, if you say like okay but you have like a laughing face, then like you kind of understand what that means, as opposed to like they just say okay. So I think that's definitely like something that helps. And I think, okay, I don't know, is it GIFs or GIFs, whatever that word is?
I don't know.
That, I think that also has kind of helped, because like they can say yes, but then like you see a reaction from it. So I think those have kind of helped get their attentions across.
Okay, should we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I think
Thank you, Abby, for that great question. We can move on to language now, and I have the first language discussion question. And my question is, people have all kinds of accents, and sometimes speakers may be negatively stereotyped by their accents. As the text mentions, it creates negative impressions with the listener when a speaker's accent is significantly different from that of the dominant group. And my question is, do you think it is okay to point out someone's accent during conversation? At what point does it get offensive? And how do you look past a thick accent to continue to engage in productive conversation?
I think...
You want to read that back one more time for us?
Yeah, sorry, that was long. I'll read the question part.
Yeah.
Do you think it is okay to point out or comment on someone's accent? At what point does it get offensive? And how do you look past a thick accent to continue to engage in productive conversation?
I don't think, like, as far as pointing out someone's accent, I wouldn't like say you should do that. But I mean, at the same time, like, if you hear someone, you're like, oh, like, are you from Germany? Like, I don't know why. Sorry, you popped on my screen. Like, oh, like, are you from Germany? And then like you have like something, if that's a way to relate to someone, yeah. But like if you point, I don't know, if you point it out, and I think it gets offensive when like people almost like mock or like repeat what you said, kind of like I don't think they mean to mock you, but like when they repeat what you said because you said it differently than they do, I think that definitely causes some. Or is it necessarily okay?
No, what I can say from my experience is that in general, like most people are super nice about when I, for example, talk with them for the first time and they recognize I have an accent. They usually ask like, "Oh, I hear an accent. Where are you from? Germany?" And it's like a good start to a conversation, and they're super nice about it, and generally like observe it as a positive thing that I speak another language as well. But I also had the experience, as you already said, where people like try to like imitate you or like try to imitate your accent, and it is kind of like just annoying in some sense because they try to imitate you and it completely sounds different, and it's like, and for me it was always like just annoying and inappropriate. So I think definitely people can get offended by it, but in general I had the experience like a very positive experience with like the acceptance and interest about accents.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I always, like you mentioned, if I recognize someone's accent from somewhere that I've traveled or lived for a while, I like to ask them about it. But I always try to make sure that I try and read the situation and make sure that it isn't bothering them. But I always think that accents are super pretty and like really interesting and like a great conversation starter. And then I also think it just allows you to like build a bond with someone if you've been to that country. Like if I visited Italy, so when I hear someone with an Italian accent, I like to ask them about their experience there and how it might relate to mine. So I think that's interesting. But now that we've spoken about microaggressions, I wonder if in some ways, like Adrian mentioned, that could be considered a microaggression to some people, or how that those two things might correlate. So yeah.
I think.
Yeah, go ahead, Nolan.
Okay. I think that it's also interesting to point out. Yeah, I think when people point out accents in the conversation, I think it's okay for the most part. I mean, I think it's like Adrian said, it's just naturally like inquisitive and just people want to know where you're from and everything like that. And obviously your accent tells people a little bit about who you are. With the, bringing it up in conversation and making fun of it or, really trying to dive deep into it, I don't like it as much. I don't think it's appropriate as much because I kind of try to view it as, I saw someone say it one time to where even a person, usually when we encounter accents, we're encountering people speaking English with, German accents, whatever it may be. And so I always kind of view it as, well, I don't know their native language and they're trying to learn my language. Like that's better than what I am doing. And so I shouldn't be, I should just try and be helping them and trying to understand them instead of, counting it negatively and, kind of writing them off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the book mainly focused on negative stereotypes when it comes to accents, but I think accents are a way of telling people that, not telling people, but just showing that you speak another language and you're bilingual, and I think that's a really positive and beautiful thing.
Should we go to the next?
Yeah.
I have a second question in language.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, it is hard for me to understand how the United States can be so limited in regard to how many languages are spoken by most citizens, considering the size and diversity of the country. What are the essential reasons for this, especially considering the impact of the increased globalization? How does the educational system in the United States view the importance of learning a second language, and how could the system be improved?
Could you read that?
You want me to read it again?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's hard for me to understand how the United States can be so limited in regard to how many languages are spoken by most citizens, considering the size and diversity of the country. What are the essential reasons for this, especially considering the impact of the increased globalization? How does the educational system in the United States view the importance of learning a second language, and how could the system be improved?
I like this question. It's a good question. I think it's interesting how like in a lot of other countries, like they learn like their language and they learn other ones, but here it's not as like highlighted, like as important or as stressed to like learn any language other than like English, and then you take a class, but like most people, how much do you really learn in those high school classes of like that other language? And so I think a lot of it has to do with like maybe like this view almost of superiority in terms of like if you know English you can communicate with everyone else because like everyone else is kind of forced to learn English.
Yeah.
So why do you need to? But I think the educational system should really view an importance on like being bilingual, like learning another language apart from yourself, because I think that adds a lot of value.
I agree. I think I only know one language and I regret so much not sticking with Italian or Spanish in high school and even in college. So I definitely think that's something that starting from elementary schools, teachers should stress a little bit more. I think it really like allows your brain to form those new connections that wouldn't have been formed otherwise. And then later in life, I think it allows you to obviously communicate with people who you wouldn't have been able to earlier. And I think we might have talked about this in class, but I think it just allows that intercultural communication to really unfold a little bit. And I think it allows you to see things in different perspectives, just based on the way the language is spoken as well.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Like I also had Spanish and French in high school, but I was like not really interested in it. So I don't speak any of it right now, which I also regret completely. But at the time I thought it wasn't important. But at that stage, like the educational system in Germany, like left it up to the student if he really wants to learn the language or if he is not gonna learn it really and don't remember anything. And just for English, I don't know why it was, they started much earlier to learn it and always made it a required class that forced us to learn the language basically. And I was just wondering if I think in the United States in the educational system, at least at college, you can like still choose if you want to do a language or not, and if so, which one. So the students are not really forced to learn another language, which I don't know why, like Maddie already said, maybe it's a little bit, I mean, obviously like English is the first language and the superior language, if it's also a little bit connected to the pride of the country, since the United States is like a really proud country. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's also interesting because in Europe, where they're most people are either bi, tri, multilingual. It's interesting to know the geography, how it plays a role in it. So Germany obviously is a lot smaller than the United States, and where I come from in the United States, I'm pretty much right in the heart and center of it. So I maybe heard Spanish back at home. Kind of understands in that time I really heard Spanish or another language back at home. And so it's interesting for me because as you know, I was growing up and we were learning Spanish in high school or whatever, there was no need for it. You know, I didn't have to communicate outside of English ever. And most people where I come from, you know, it's you live there, you grow up there, you die there. So you don't really go outside of that. And I think that has something to do with it as well, to where most people are like, why do I need to learn another language if I'm never going to, you know, leave like 50 square mile radius?
Yeah, I think that's like a huge point because as you said, there's like, for many people, there's no like necessary need to learn another language because a lot of people stay their whole life in the United States and they don't go overseas because the United States is just so big. But for example, like if you're in Europe, like countries are so small, like if you leave a country there, it's like leaving a state here, like going from Texas to Oklahoma is like going from Germany to Italy or something. So, and there are different languages being spoken while here it's one language. So I think you made a really good point that like there's no really need for a lot of people to learn a language.
And I think that's a really good point that you made, Nolan, about geography playing a huge part, because like you guys were all saying, when you travel in the United States, you just go from one state to another, but in Europe, you go from one country to another. And I think just in the US, just because it's so big, you experience the American culture, but in Europe, when you're traveling from one country to another country, you experience such different cultures. And I think that just kind of ties back into the language that you speak to and the languages that you learn.
Yeah, for sure.
Did you do the last question?
Yeah, let's do it.
That was the last question, but I think I did the second question for nonverbal. Sorry, I should have said something earlier.
Oh, good.
Sorry, we skipped over that, but we can go back to
Oh yeah, no, you're totally good. So in the book, it kind of talks about how like it was talking about like skin color, and it says like the United States is not the only location where like members are like judged or like by the skin, by like the color of their skin. And so I was just curious to know. So like, for example, in like Asia, like they do really value like lighter skin, but they'll do whatever they can to like stay light, whether that's, you know, wearing a hat and things of that sort. But in the United States, do you think that like everyone like wants to go out and get tan and like get darker? So do you think like does the United States value darker skin, or do they value lighter skin kind of thing? And then what does that have to do with like our not roots, but like I don't know if my question makes sense, but
That makes sense.
yeah, kind of thing. Like
It makes
I guess
sense.
historically we value lighter skin, but is that shifting, or is it just like people still don't value or like value darker skin, but they want to be darker? I don't know if that makes sense.
So I think like for other cultures, maybe like the whiter skin is like more valued, because I think in a lot of cultures it used to be a sign of like wealth, because the people that were usually like white, they didn't have to go outside in the to work or something, so and would stay inside all day, so their skin would stay white kind of thing. But I think in the US definitely like being more tan is being observed as being more attractive. So like I feel like there's a huge trend that a lot of people try, you know, to get tanned, and like in Southern California it's pretty easy because the weather's pretty good, but like there are so many like studios that offer those like sunbathing things, because people want to be tan because it's just like generally seen as attractive, I think.
I agree, and I think it's funny that that being tan has become such a big part of beauty culture, because in reality it's, you know, it's not good for your skin at all. It's not good for you. It causes skin cancer. But I think it's interesting that we've put so much value on being tan that we're okay with having that possibility in our future, just to make sure that we look up to social standards of what is perceived as beauty. So I think that's another kind of interesting aspect to it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how like we want to get tan, like we want to tan, but then like in other countries, like they want to bleach their skin.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and I think
it's also, you can go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, I think it's really interesting too, because you mentioned that Asian cultures, there's an emphasis on being pale, and back in Asia, I'll find a lot of products that are whitening products, but coming here, I'll find a lot of products that are to make your skin darker or to look more tan. So the contrast is definitely really interesting, and it's also interesting how companies, especially beauty companies, will come up with these products that target what the beauty standards are in that culture.
Oh yeah, no, that's true.
Yeah, also going off of that, so like what you said, so, you know, having fair skin meant that you didn't have to, you know, go outside for work, weren't working outside often, and things of that nature, where now I think having darker skin might also play a role into that in the United States, by saying I have the time to go outside like and work during, you know, where most of our jobs have obviously moved indoors, and now it's like I have the time. I don't need to work all the time, and I can, you know, go tan or whatever. And I think it also has to do with, yeah, I guess as we are more mixed ethnically and racially as a country, that darker skin is seen as more of a beauty standard, since there's a lot more people. I feel like a lot more people are moving away from, I guess, being white, since whites are now going to be the minority in like 2040 or something like that. I think we read that in like one of the earlier chapters. So it's interesting to see how that kind of trend is moving along with it, as you know, white people are slowly becoming the minority.
That's true.
Yeah, I think you make an interesting point. It's interesting that now your tanness can be like a show of socioeconomic level, and showing that you have enough money to not work all day every day, and that you can waste your time going outside and just sitting in the sun. I think that's a really interesting point that I hadn't thought of.
Kind of flipped.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Okay. Good job, guys.
That was a great discussion.
That's all.
Thank you guys for all your questions.
Yeah, thank you too.
Thank you.
Do you want to stop recording, and I guess we can all